Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or good evening if you're joining us from Europe. I am Harish, Product Marketing Manager for Zoho People. I am really happy to welcome you to this webinar on what HR should be doing during this pandemic. Now, that's a question on everyone's mind, isn't it? Because this is a tough period for organizations, and especially so for human resources, because there's a lot of things that now you have to rethink, from reallocation of resources to other departments, to thinking of new ways to manage a workforce that is completely gone remote, working from their homes, working from their parents' place in their hometowns. They've spread across the country now. So we have to find new ways of managing this workforce, new ways of measuring performance and evaluating their performance. There are a lot of things on your mind. So we thought you could really use some expert advice on this. So we actually did this webinar a couple of weeks back, and we had a lot of customers attending and asking questions to the industry expert that we have with us today. But after that, we had a lot of customers sending us emails asking us if we can have this once more, because they had questions and they really wanted to attend the webinar again. So we had asked Nick, and he has so graciously accepted to do this webinar again. But so without any further ado, let me just quickly introduce Nick and get out of the way so he can start this wonderful session. Nick has been in the industry for more than 40 years. He is the Director of Learning at Corporate Research Forum, a platform that creates HR development programs. CRF, Corporate Research Forum, focuses on enhancing the effectiveness of HR operations. Nick has vast experience working with HR professionals and organizations worldwide, a few of them enterprise companies like Rolls-Royce, Shell Global, Alliance Group, among others. And Nick was voted the fifth most influential thinker in human resources by the HR magazine. I'm really looking forward to this session. I've hosted a couple of these before, and they turned out to be great. And a quick heads up before we get started, you're on listen only mode. If you have any questions, please share those questions with us through the questions section that you see on the GoToWebinar panel. Nick will be answering those questions once every 10-15 minutes. It'll be a session where he addresses the top questions. I'm apologizing in advance if you don't get answers to your questions immediately, but we'll try our best to get answers to all your questions. Right, with having said that, let me just hand it over to Nick. Nick, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. So it's good evening from me. Good morning, I guess, to an awful lot of you. Thanks for sparing the time. One thing I'd add with what Harish said is, although I was voted the fifth most influential thinker, I don't see myself as a thinker. I see myself as a practitioner. My background has been in business with organizations like Merrill Lynch and Arthur Andersen and Vodafone. Last 14 years, I've worked with probably over 100 companies in 30 different countries, including in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Seattle, Chicago, Mexico City, Vancouver. So also over your side of the pond. So I do bring to this a lot of practical experience, and a lot of what I'm talking about isn't theory. These are conversations that we've been having with organizations all over the world that I'm going to try and summarize into some key learnings. I'm going to talk about three phases, and the first phase is survive. So the first question is, what should HR be doing today? And I'm going to talk through that, but also increasingly, I don't know what you're seeing, but about a month ago, I was talking about the importance of the second two phases, reset and survive. And increasingly, we, for instance, run a webinar where we don't present anything. We have about 40 to 50 group HR directors from big companies, just giving them a chance to chat to each other and share. And the theme that's coming out from there is people want to be thinking about the future now. And I'm going to share later on what HR can do to reset, but also help the business reset. And finally, how we thrive, because we will come out of this. And what we are doing today with our people and how we're thinking about that thrive will define how organizations survive or thrive. I was listening to another person earlier today, and it was interesting that looking back to 2009 and looking at the organizations that since then, in terms of at least one metric, total shareholder return, the organizations that have thrived were the ones that took tough decisions quickly, but then very quickly began to work with people in their organizations to think about how they reset the laws of competition, how they acquired competitors that were in trouble. The ones that moved fast were the ones who were prepared, who were the ones who then thrived. So what I want to talk about, first of all, is the need to rebalance. I'm very lucky in my position. I get to talk to a lot of very senior HR people, particularly when I've been a professor. For some reason, people will talk to you in a way they don't talk to a consultant. I think it's they recognize that you're doing this for the sake of the profession. So I interviewed 45 COs and HR directors, and the balance was an interesting point. They all said they expect their finance director to be operating in the short term, the next 12 months, but they needed somebody to balance on their team, to think about the long term, to think about sustainability. And we need to be that balance. But I think at the moment in the survive phase, we also within each HR need to think about the balance of time we spend on the short term as opposed to the long term. You know, I think that the pressure to cut costs is absolutely realistic, and we as a function need to engage in those kinds of conversations with the business. But we still need to provide the balance and have the courage to challenge some of the longer term implications of what we're doing, and probably even more importantly, how we do it. I don't know if it's an urban myth, but I saw a story this week of a US tech company that had sacked 400 people on a Zoom call that was not interactive, that lasted 10 minutes and didn't have the CEO. Now, the thing to think about with that is it's not just how the people are leaving think, it's how the survivors think. And, you know, I've been through a lot of recessions in my life, and the survivor syndrome, the way that the survivors think about what you're doing and how you're doing it, is going to have long-term implications. But if we are going to challenge some of these short-term knee-jerk reactions, we need to do it in the language of data and the language of numbers, because that's the kind of conversation that CEOs and FDs will understand. We need to make sure, as I say, that these conversations are based on fact. Now, I want to share another little story. A very good colleague of mine, friend of mine, was involved in a British government war game back in 2005, where over several days they war gamed how would government respond to a global pandemic. Even though this is a black swan, a lot of people knew that, you know, we've had the Spanish flu, we've had SARS, MERS. It was likely that something else would hit. Now, they learned two things through that. First of all, they knew they couldn't predict exactly what was going to happen. They also knew that the media, the press, social media, which 15 years ago wasn't as powerful as it was today, would be full of so-called experts who pretended they had crystal balls and could predict exactly what was going to happen in the future. They knew then that they couldn't predict the future, and it's happening now. And I think in HR, we need not to react to social media, to anecdotes, etc. We just cannot possibly predict what the future is going to hold. And in that environment, I think we need to reframe how we think about the future and what we do today. Traditionally, what we've done in business is we do a massive piece of analysis. We bring in some expensive strategic consultant who will then predict what the future is going to be, and then we will plan for that future. In this environment, in a black swan environment, we can't predict the future, and therefore we can't plan. But as I said at the beginning, the companies that did well back in 2009 were the ones who prepared for the future. I'll give you an example. I'm working with the largest German wholesale pharmaceutical company. Interesting organization. I'm sure that's the same with a lot of organizations. Their sales team have never been busier with the avalanche of orders, but in terms of their operational fulfillment in their distribution centers and warehouses, they're under huge pressure, not just because of the volume, but because of social distancing, because of the number of staff who are off sick or self-isolating. And what I've been working on with their CEO and his team is to put together online task forces, not just senior people, but people from across the business to work virtually to scenario plan. The idea is these teams aren't trying to predict and plan for a future. They are trying to hypothesize about alternative futures and think through what they can do. Because when they come out of it, they will have plans in place that they can then implement that will put them ahead of their competition. So this isn't about predicting the outcome, it's about preparing for different outcomes. But the key other part of the story is we need to do it with people, not to them. You know, this is not the time to bring in consultants to tell us what to do. This is the time to engage. And as I said, not just senior leaders, the normal people you'd engage with. It's a chance to engage some of your high potentials, some of the people who will be the leaders in this future, and get them thinking today about what they should be thinking about. This has always been one of my bugbears. Too many people in HR focus on HR as opposed to focusing on the organization, focusing on the business, the industry they're in. And at the moment, really focusing on our employees and our people, because they are going to be the people who will take us out the other side. So what does that mean? If you're a global business, I would seriously question any centralized global HR-driven initiatives, you know, like performance management or whatever. Is this really the time to be pushing HR processes? Another thing I would seriously question is there are still a lot of HR functions who are in the middle of HR transformations. In my opinion, this is not the time to be looking at your navel, worrying about an HR transformation. This is the time to be in the business. And I think we need to be redeploying almost everybody in HR into much more operational roles, much closer to the business, so everybody becomes an HR business partner. And I think this will pay dividends, not just today, but it'll pay dividends in the future as HR people are much more closely connected and focused on making a difference to the business, not doing HR stuff that nobody else in the business. And it's interesting, in the webinar this morning in the Far East and Southeast Asia, somebody said that, you know, they were involved in doing some of these things. What was my advice? And my advice was just stop it. Just don't do it. I've mentioned already organizations that learned from the crisis in 2009. And at the time, I did some big research. I spoke to a lot of organizations, and I spoke to the EMEA HR director of one of the biggest US tech companies, a massive database company, but I won't mention which one. And he gave me this phrase. He said, never waste a good crisis. What he meant by that was he in Europe had faced a number of companies that hid behind employment law, that hid behind works councils and trade unions, and refused to undertake actions that they needed to take. What he was able to do was use the crisis as an opportunity to address these underlying issues of cost effectiveness and underperformance, because nobody could deny them, nobody could hide from them. And I think this is a real opportunity. So don't waste the crisis. Address some of those fundamental issues because nobody can deny them. This is obviously an incredibly stressful environment. People are very, very uncertain. And to me, in uncertainty and change, there are 3 rules: communicate, communicate, and communicate. And if you're in any doubt, communicate some more. But we need to reframe what we mean by communication. First of all, we do need to communicate bad news. We need to be upfront and honest with people. Back in the early 90s, I was head of OD in a utility, and we'd been privatized. We were grossly overmanned. And as head of OD, I had to put together a plan to basically make 25% of our workforce redundant. And I briefed the CEO. The CEO communicated the bad news. And at the very end, he suddenly says, and I just want to reassure you all that these will be the last redundancies. And so when he finished, I just went up and said, "What? Why did you say that? That wasn't part of the script." And he said, "But Nick, I wanted to reassure people. That's what people wanted to hear." And about 6 months later, we went through another round of redundancies. Nobody ever trusted him again. And I think we have to really work with our managers in communicating bad news, to be authentic, to be there for people. Because as I say, I've seen some wonderful examples of CEOs doing some amazing communication, but in my experience, they're often not very good. And in my experience, most internal communications functions focus on the words, not the impact the words are having. And therefore, I think bad news and news at the moment must be delivered by managers. But we have to remember that they are going to be under pressure themselves. And I said about HR getting closer to the front line. So I think we have to reframe HR's role to how can we support our managers with online learning and training, but also with coaching. And one of the joys of Zoom or GoTo or FaceTime or whatever tool we use, Teams, we can do that face to face, because we really need to help managers understand that they might be thinking that people related issues are less important at the moment, when actually they're even more important. And we need to get close to them and support them and help them maintain morals by being visible with their people. But I think the key to me, and I'm going to come back to this, is we need them to get them to recognize that communication is two-way, because that's what people really want to do, is not just listen to the messaging, they want to share their own situation. So the most important thing is when you talk to your people as a manager, the first thing you ask them is not, have you delivered what I asked you to deliver? The first question is, how are you? And we need to get close to managers to help them understand that. Because obviously with remote working, it's really important that people continue to connect. And I look back now to when I started in business 40 years ago. There were no mobile phones. There weren't even computers in those days. The most important person in our office was the telex operator. And I bet most of you won't even know what a telex machine was. But we now can connect. We can now communicate much more effectively. And we need to help people connect, which means we need to facilitate connectivity, bandwidth, etc. It was interesting. A friend of mine was telling me about a call he had this morning where he was in the middle of a webinar and he got cut off because the bandwidth in his house could only support him or his wife, and he hadn't told his wife he was on a webinar. She opened a webinar up and cut him off. And I know these things might sound basic, and hopefully you're dealing with them, but we really need to think about how we help people connect. Now, I've mentioned the importance of rebalancing, and we shouldn't forget the long term. And part of the long term is how do we continue to develop and help our people learn? Now, I mentioned that we have an HR directors get together. We also have an L&D directors get together. And it fascinated me, the head of L&D from a really big American-based global business, he said, up until the last couple of weeks, his job was running an L&D function, delivering programs, etc., etc. He said his role has completely changed to being the coach for his executive leadership team, because we should never forget, and I'll come back to this, how much pressure our leaders are under. Everybody's looking for them, but they probably have relatives who maybe have got COVID. They're probably socially isolated. They're going through the same things, but the pressure's multiplied because everybody's looking at them. So we should not forget the importance of developing our people. Interesting, in the call with the L&D people, I detected that there were 3 stages they went through. The first stage was panic. Oh, we're delivering 100 programs in the next month. We've got all these hotel booked. We've got the flights coming in. We've got people coming from all over the world. We've got to stop that. But how are we going to get the flights back? And it was panic. Then there was a second phase, which wasn't panic, but was still reactive. Let's get all our learning online. Let's just stick everything on the internet so everybody can learn all the time. What I'm detecting now is a much more nuanced focus on, in the short term, I think we're probably getting out of this phase. If you use GoTo or Teams, you better be teaching people how to use it. You need to be helping managers learn how to work remotely. But I think increasingly, as we move into reset, we need to be thinking, how will we reset our strategy as a business? What will this mean for the capabilities that we will need in the future? And how do they match what we have today? And how do we fill the gap? And therefore, what learning do we need to be delivering today, so when we're into a new business model, we are ready for it like that, rather than we come out of it, we reset, and they think, oh, what are we going to do? Because your competitors will be ahead of you. But we can deliver that learning online. We can deliver bite-sized learning. I went through my own sort of phase where a few weeks ago I had this awful, everything I was due to deliver was cancelled almost overnight. But increasingly, I'm working with my customers to put together, I'm working on one with a Seattle-based company where globally, because they operate all over the world, we will have a 5-day learning program where day 1, we'll do a 1-hour webinar as an introduction. We'll have some chat rooms, etc. We'll set some homework, some tasks. We'll have webinars on Tuesday and Wednesday. On Thursday, we'll have sharing platforms where they can work on some questions. And then on Friday, there'll be 25 people in total working in 5 groups of 5. They'll be delivering proposals to the group HR director. It's an HR business partner audience. And we'll be delivering that 8 times, with some first thing in the morning for Asia and Australia, some middle of the day for Europe, some at the end of the day for the US. We need to rethink and not suddenly stop learning. I think learning becomes even more important than it ever was. And I think L&D's role will be coaching, and also will be driving reflection, because we as HR professionals know that you don't learn just by listening to me talking like this. You learn by the what, the webinar, but you learn by the so what, so what have I learned, and the now what. Now what am I going to do differently? And I think L&D can really facilitate chat rooms and one-to-one conversations to have those so what, now what conversations. I've got one more slide I want to talk through, and then we'll move on to some questions. And certainly this morning, this was the most of the questions were coming about remote working. And before I go into that, I want to paint a scenario and give you a little exercise to think through. It's very, very simple. I'd like you to go back to August 2019. So it's fall. See, I can speak American. For us, it's autumn, but it's fall 2019. And you've been asked to put together a working party to transfer 50% of your staff to remote home working. How long do you think it's going to take you? Don't forget, you're back in fall 2019. How long is it going to take you to find the right people, get their commitment? How long will it take them for them to come up with a set of recommendations with all the conversations they'll need to have? How long, this is the big question, is it going to take them to get approval for those recommendations from all the people in the business who absolutely know you can't trust people to work from home? It doesn't work. You know, we're a face-to-face business. We can't do things remotely. And then how long is it going to take you to implement their recommendations? Now, jump forward to 2 or 3 weeks ago. You did all of that in a matter of days. And I think that's one of the learnings we need to take out of this is remote working does work, but we need to think about how to help it work. So first of all, I come back to something I said earlier. We know employee engagement is going to become a strategic imperative from now on. And in my research when I was a professor, I found 4 things drive engagement. Sometimes it's the company or the organization, and anybody in healthcare at the moment is engaged because they're helping save lives. Some people are engaged by the job, like R&D people. Some people are naturally engaged, so why recruit people who are emotional hoovers? But the thing that really engages is managers. And again, I come back, the secret to remote working is helping coach managers on how to manage remotely, not just work remotely. I think it means they need to set clear expectations, not just of what they want, but things like calendar sharing, response times. We need to help them use remote online project management software so they can plan and share projects remotely. I've already said about communicating. If we don't communicate, people will feel abandoned. So managers need to regularly get on a video call and chat to their people. It must be video because 93%, that's some work by Albert Morabian, of communication is not the words, it's the tone of voice and the body language. I find this, by the way, really difficult to present because I can't see or hear any of you. So I don't know if you're all sitting there doing your emails or you're bored or whatever. But the advantage of one-to-one is you can actually have that face-to-face communication. And as I say, it's engaging with people beyond work as human beings, checking in with them. How are they? Discussing their longer-term career and development. It's still relevant to people. We need to show we care. I think another thing is the virtual water cooler. Just people need to connect socially as well as for work. And I think it's, for instance, with CRF, what we do is every Friday at 4 o'clock, we have a drink. So everybody gets a beer. In my case, it's a glass of Italian red wine. But each week, somebody runs a quiz and we just chat. Nothing, work is not allowed. It's just connecting. Because loneliness and isolation are big issues with remote working. There is a neurological condition called social interaction atrophy. This is not a mental illness, it's something physical, that when we don't interact, brain cells die. So the frightening thing is we are getting more stupid during this. Now, for me, I always blame this on my old age, but we need to provide ways for people to connect. And the last thing is, if you're in a global business, be aware of time zones. You know, when I was a partner at Arthur Andersen, I was part of the leadership team for learning and development, and it was interesting. It was a global leadership team, so 5 Americans and me. It's not an issue about them being Americans. It's just 5 Americans and Englishmen. Most of the rest of the world don't see that as global. But as the Englishman living in England, my frustration was the number of times I would get calls or I would get meeting requests for a 5 p.m. meeting. Because, of course, being Arthur Andersen, everybody works long hours. And I kept having to say, but in Chicago, it's 5. In London, it's 11 o'clock at night. And there was no empathy for that. And I, you know, I did pick up, oh, Nick's not committed because he can't attend all these meetings. Well, maybe you should organize the meetings in your morning. Maybe you need to organize meetings where it's inconvenient, not just for the people who aren't central, but for other people. So the last point before I open for questions is there are probably people in your organizations who have worked remotely or have managed remotely for a long period of time. One of my questions is, have you gone to them and asked them how to do it? It never ceased to amaze me how we don't talk to other people in our organization and share what we've already learned about it. Instead of that, you get somebody goes online and reads the latest website and tries to tell people what to do. Why don't we actually leverage the best resource we have, which is each other? So let me stop talking, because you must be bored to tears listening to me, and open it up. Are there any questions that people have, or any stories they'd like to share or tell? So I am going to assume, Harish, there are no questions coming in?
Nick, actually, there's a question. I posted it to you using the chat space.
Oh, okay. I've got the question one. We were using questions earlier. Hang on.
Okay.
I need to go and could you read it out to me? Because I'm just trying to.
Yeah.
Ah, here we go. Hang on. I think I'm just clicking on it.
Sure.
Ah, here we go. Should remote working be considered as an option in our future business strategies? Yes, absolutely. I'm going to talk about that when I talk about the next phase, but surely this is teaching us that remote working works. My wife, she's working from home now, but she had a 1.5 hour commute to work and a 1.5 hour commute home from work. So she can actually start work earlier and be less stressed because she doesn't have to waste 3 hours a day. Now, I don't know if any of you work in big cities, but I've been all over the world and commutes can be absolutely horrendous. But I think it's really important that in the future we learn from today and make remote working a much, much better experience. And also, I think we need to trust people. I've heard stories of managers who have their cameras switched on in all their teams and keep an eye on them and make sure they're working. You know, you should be managing people on the basis of their output, not whether they're at their desk working. My son is head of HR for a tech startup in Copenhagen. He's about 28 years old, but he's still a bit of a teenager. He doesn't do mornings. So him starting work at 9 doesn't work for him. He'd rather work a little bit later in the day. Next question was, what shift do you see in the role of HR in the times to come? I don't see any shift, to be honest. But I think it might be a shift for some HR functions, but the good HR functions won't need to shift. The good HR functions have always focused not on HR, but on the business. Good HR see their purpose as building the capability of an organization to deliver its strategy and to create sustainable value for all its key stakeholders. And whilst the content of the value creation and whilst the capability you need to develop will change, the philosophy and how you go about that, and therefore the role of HR, in my opinion, won't change at all. But I think it is going to give a kick up the to those HR people who are solutions looking for problems. to these people who whinge, I haven't got a seat at the table. Well, usually when you haven't got a seat at the table, you don't deserve one because you're not close enough to the business. If you focus on adding value to the business, and if you focus your role on being in the business, not sitting in an HR office, totally disconnected from the business, then the role will remain the same. What changes do you recommend to be made to workplace culture after the pandemic? So there are a couple of things here. First of all, that makes an assumption that I can recommend a culture for your organization. One of my passions is too many organizations, particularly HR people, go to consultancies to ask them what culture they need, or they read some book about I saw one recently from some US Navy captain about the culture on his ship during the Gulf War. Well, how many of you are in a war zone in a warship? How on earth is that culture relevant? So I think the answer to what do you recommend about workplace culture after the pandemic is you need to be thinking today about resetting your strategy and thinking what culture will you require. I also think that you won't require one culture, probably a set of common values, but in my experience, the culture of a sales team and the culture of a call center and the culture of an R&D team, they might be in the same business, but they're very, very different cultures. And to me, culture, like structure, should be driven by strategy. My other point is, what changes do you recommend be made to workplace culture after the pandemic? Why wait? You need to be resetting your strategy and therefore resetting your culture. But I'm going to come back and talk about that in a second. Unless there are any more questions, I apologize. I was keeping an eye on the questions, not on the chat. So I'll keep an eye on chat. So please feel free to stick any more questions up there. So let me move on to this second reset phase, because we will come out of this. There's no doubt of that. And at the beginning, whilst I said we need to rebalance in favor of the short term, I think one of the important roles of HR is to be preparing, not planning, but preparing for the future. And in my experience, I don't know about your experience, I find most operational, particularly line managers, are very short term in their thinking. They're very focused because they're given numbers and targets to deliver. They don't tend to think future back. And what we need to be thinking and preparing for is, in a year's time, where will the world be? Where will our markets be? Where will our companies be? And how do we reset and prepare for that? Don't forget, this is scenario planning, not one plan. But I think whatever, we are going to face a massive productivity challenge when we move out of the crisis. The economy is not going to go like that. I don't know how it will go, but I can't see demand coming back to the same levels that we saw before the turn of the year. And therefore, there will be a huge productivity challenge. And as I said, I think HR has a critical role in facilitating conversations now with the line to understand what those options might be and to understand which parts of the business will be most critical. Because I think what's going to happen is parts of the business that were in the spotlight won't be, and other parts of the business will become critical in the future. And the companies that are prepared for that and the companies that know what to do will thrive. So one of the implications of this is HR needs to facilitate the conversations, but with who? And I think you've got to deploy your best HR people into the areas that are going to address this productivity challenge in the future. And these won't necessarily be the areas they've traditionally supported. one test I've given to HR directors is, if you write down on the left-hand side of the sheet of paper your best HR people in order of their capability, and on the right-hand side you write down how critical each area of the business is for the future, for value creation, do the two match? Because often what you find is this person here is supporting this business that doesn't really matter, and this business here that's critical is supported by this person because that's how it's always been. I think what we need to do is do that, but redraw the list on the right hand side, because the danger is that people gravitate to support people they like. I think a lot of HR people, and I am absolutely one of them, it's been one of my problems in my working life, is I like to be liked. And sometimes I would take the easy option. In fact, one of my ex-bosses gave me a great piece of feedback. He said, your problem, Nick, is you tend to focus on the people who share your passion. And the problem is most of them don't matter. And I didn't like it, but when I reflected on it, it had a massive impact on my career. I had to work out who were the people who created value and how did I support them, even though a lot of them were not very pleasant people who I really didn't like. That was not their problem, it was my problem. I think the other thing with this is we need to be contributing to these conversations. We need to have an opinion and a position and be prepared, which means not just thinking about HR and people, but thinking about the strategic future of the industry, the sector you're in, and your business, which means you need to be, or encouraging your HR people to spend time researching and thinking. I think one of the diseases we suffer from, or the games that we play, as Eric Byrne would have called it, is busy, busy, busy. The number of people in HR I know who claim to be busy, what I find out is they aren't really busy. They want to appear busy so everybody thinks they're doing a good job. And if you actually just stopped doing a whole load of stuff that doesn't add value and that is difficult to implement and freed up the time to think more, I think we'd add an awful lot more value. I think the second challenge when we come out will be the need to re-energize people. And what we do today is going to have a massive impact on that. So I would avoid knee-jerk reactions. Think about it. People have long memories. If you go back to 2009, a lot of people left their organizations when they come out the other side because they could, and because their organization had not persuaded them to stay. And the demographic crisis we face, particularly in the US and Europe with our aging populations, particularly if we stop immigration, those long-term demographic trends won't go away. And retaining your best performers and your critical staff, especially the staff who will be critical in the next phase, is strategically critical. So we need to work out who are our highest performers, who are our highest potentials, because the danger is they're the ones who will be looking at the job boards and speaking to recruiters. So you, even more than before, you need to get close to them and listen to their concerns. By the way, this also might be a great opportunity to poach critical talent from your competitors, especially if they are not doing what they should be doing. But there are things you can prepare today to re-energize in the future, reinforcing the vision, the purpose of the organization, involving people in decision making and empowering them in thinking about the future, communicating more, reinvesting in upskilling people with the new skills they're going to need, recognizing success. I am sure that people are doing amazing things. You need to communicate and recognize that, and not just the things they're doing in their organization, but the things that are going on in their communities. Improving the work environment, helping teams bond, developing your leaders and your managers' ability to engage with their people. Because to me, If you create a culture of care today, if you make sure your managers are asking people how they are, not just what they're doing, if you celebrate caring, if you continue to invest in your people and train your managers in how to engage their people, then I think this is going to pay dividends in the long term. And you know, in the last recession, the survivors never forgot how their colleagues were treated. So I am not saying don't lay people off. We have to be realistic, or putting on people on reduced hours, but think really carefully how you do it. So again, let me give you another chat before I run through my last few slides. Any other questions or observations? And thank you for bearing with me. One of the things I've observed is actually concentrating on webinars, etc., is really exhausting, and we shouldn't forget that. So what common practice organizations give up to cut costs and rebuild their economy? Well, I think we can start in HR. We can cut costs by stopping doing stuff that doesn't create value and is difficult to implement. In my opinion, that includes performance management and appraisals, competency frameworks, all these stuff that we like to buy from consultancies and that we pretend that it's going to actually help our business. But again, I think we need to be rigorous in looking at how we rebuild our business and what will matter them, and making sure we build that today and look at maybe cutting things that aren't as relevant. Should companies focus on health and wellness benefits post-pandemic? Yes, surely, if this teaches us one thing, we have to. Now, I can't comment on that because I'm lucky to live in a country where all our healthcare is free. Obviously, you live if you're in the US, you live in a country where healthcare has such a massive impact on your economy and the viability of organizations. But if we come back to this point about caring for people, you know, surely we have to really focus on health. And also, I think we really need to focus on a more systemic, integrated, strategic approach to wellness, because I think wellness is also about helping our people think about their mental, physical, and spiritual health, not just providing health insurance. Is it advisable to measure productivity when your workforce is working from home? Yes, but we have to measure productivity in terms of outputs and deliverables. The danger is we measure productivity in terms of input, that we assume if somebody is at their desk that they are being productive. How do you know that I'm at my desk? I appear to be working here, but actually, so for instance, I have two computers. I have my desktop here, which I've got the slides and the webinar. I have my laptop here, where I'm keeping an eye on my slides. I have a script, etc. Well, what's to say that I'm looking at you, my manager, you think I'm working and I'm playing solitaire on my laptop. So I think it is critical we measure productivity, but we've got to be clear what productivity means, and it's about measuring outputs. And I think we need to become much, much cuter, because HR in particular, I think we're guilty of measuring inputs, not outputs. So if you talk about performance management, which I do hate, but I bet you if I asked you all what percentage of your people had goals this year, you could go into your system, whatever, and tell me the percentage. If I was to ask you what percentage of those goals are the right goals, I bet almost none of you could answer that question. But which question matters from a productivity perspective? The fact that people have goals, or they're goals that will actually align together to deliver the strategy and delight customers. And I think we need to take that as a view of productivity, the end output, not whether people are sitting at their desks. Because if you do that, you just reward people for presenteeism, not the people who are working really, really hard. So we'll have a chance for a few more questions at the end, but let me just move on to this final phase of as we come out the other side, I think it is going to be really, really important that we reflect on the lessons. And I think all of these questions that you're answering here, you have the answers within your organization if you invest time in reflecting with the right people who can give you insights. The danger is if you're spending your whole time playing with your competency framework or your leadership program or your performance management system, you won't have time to do what really matters, which is to reflect. And the research in 2009 I did, what absolutely amazed me was how few people had gone back to the previous recession and asked what they'd learned from it. Now is probably not the time to spend all your time reflecting, but as we begin to come out of the crisis, I think we mindfully need to spend time reflecting on what we can actually learn from the past. And I think one of the things that we can learn at the moment is about our leaders. Never forget, as HR, we don't work for our leaders. We work for the long-term sustainability of the organization. And I think we need to be taking an objective look at our leaders in the organization. One of the best HR directors I know is somebody called Jenny Duvalier, who was the HR director of ARM, who make a lot of the software in an iPhone. She worked out that the big problem in her organization, it wasn't ARM, by the way, it's a previous role, was her boss, the CEO. She had to go to the chair and say, all the problems we're facing are down to the CEO. The chair agreed. She was a bit shocked because she expected him to take his role to sack the CEO, but he said, no, Jenny, could you invite him into your office and sack him for me? But the point is, we don't work for managers and leaders. We work for the organization. And this is the best leadership assessment center we've ever seen. This is a chance for us to actually observe our leaders. Who's stepping up to the plate? Who is leading and who's disappearing? Because you will really see whether leaders can lead in the crisis we're going through at the moment. I also, by the way, think this is the best way of measuring your leadership development programs. Because if you've been teaching leaders to lead in a human-centric way or whatever, if they're not delivering those behaviors, either you have a really shit leadership development program or all your leaders are incompetent. Now, it might be they're all incompetent, but I suspect not. I think you can really observe whether you're investing money in a good way in developing your leaders. So the last point, and this comes back to some of the questions you've asked, I think working remotely and virtually will become the new norm. I think suits and ties, 9 to 5, I think these are going to go. Because you spend less money on travel, you have more video calls, more online learning. This doesn't just save direct cost. The big thing is it saves the opportunity cost of people's time, which has a financial value. So I think we need to ensure our online working methods are technologically seamless, people have access to bandwidth, and they're properly trained. I think it will also accelerate other trends in the world of work. Such as automation, machine learning, robots. And I think this will impact not just manufacturing and the brawn industries, I think it's going to have a massive impact on brain industries. And I think out of this, HR will be renamed. It'll still be HR, but it'll be humans and robots. Because I think HR needs to engage now in what this means for our business and become experts, not just in people, but in productivity. And I think we need to take the opportunity to sweep away all these old ways of working and create a more engaged, more energized, and more productive workforce. So those are my slides in the formal bit. But again, in the last 5 minutes, any observations, questions? I see you've all, I'm really impressed. You've stuck with me for 55 minutes. I'm not sure I'd stick with me for 55 minutes, but please, any questions, observations? So what changes or a vision of travel policies will be ideal post-pandemic? Do you know what? In a lot of ways, I don't think we'll need to change the policy, because I don't think people will want to travel. I'm not sure I want to get on a plane and sit next to two people and queue up at the moment. But again, I just think we've erred in the past on we need people to travel because face-to-face contact is so important. And I think we need to frame travel policies in the future in terms of being much clearer about the business value and being honest that some people travel because they like travel. Some people travel because they want to get their gold card and their air miles or whatever. I think we need to be much more rigorous in thinking about travel. How to encourage team members to be self-motivated and self-disciplined to work efficiently and effectively. So I think this is a manager's role in doing that. But maybe I'm naive. What my observation, and most of the organizations I'm speaking to, this isn't an issue for them. What they're finding is people are actually working harder and going the extra mile because they're not stupid. They know that any organization is in trouble at the moment and that they can help it get out of trouble. I think most people, I think this idea that we motivate people is the wrong framing. I think most people are naturally motivated, and sometimes we need to get out of the way. If you Google the smell of the place, there's a brilliant video from a famous management thinker, Sumantra Ghoshal, used to teach at INSEAD, one of the top business schools in Europe. And the story he tells is he doesn't come from France, he's from India. He's from the city of Kolkata. Every summer in August, he goes to Kolkata on holiday because that's the only time his kids are on school vacation. And when he's there, it's 100 degrees, 99% humidity, and he sits in his house and he doesn't create. Every spring, he goes for a walk in the forest of Fontainebleau. You won't know the forest of Fontainebleau, but he talks about this energizing place with the smell of the pine trees, the fresh air, the crisp, the birds singing. He goes back to his office and he creates these amazing thoughts. And his challenge is, why do most organizations create downtown Calcutta in the summer, not Fontainebleau Forest in the spring? And I think this is HR's role, is how do we create the environment in which everybody can be the best they can be? Not just focus on the highest potentials, highest performers, but how can you create the environment? And that to me is the trick. I see 1 minute to go, so maybe I'll hand back to Harish just to say anything to summarize at the end.
Thank you, Nick. That was a fantastic session. You've reminded me of flying, and I really miss flying. I'm just going to go back and look at all my old photos and relive those moments, and hope we get to fly and travel once more, even in the new normal time, which is what we are heading towards, right? And ladies and gentlemen, I have just one thing to say. If you like this session, please let us know on Twitter or LinkedIn. We'd be happy to share it through our Facebook, our Twitter or LinkedIn pages. And Nick is active on Twitter and LinkedIn. You can share posts. Let us know if you like this webinar, and we'd be happy to see them. And if you have any questions, even after the session, you can send it to us at support@zohopeople.com, and we will try to get answers for those questions from Nick if we can. Right? Thank you so much for attending the session, and have a good one. Stay safe. Let's flatten the curve together. Thanks. Thank you so much, Nick.
And as they said in Hill Street Blues, be careful out there. Thanks, everyone.